Sounds like we're good to go. Welcome, everyone. We would love to hear from who you are. If you're coming to the chat, we'd love to hear, introduce yourself, say your name, say where you're coming from, your company. We'd love to hear kind of who's tuning in throughout. We'll also use the chat channel to ask questions of our speakers, and I'll be reading those and filtering those throughout the conversation. Like Luke said, I'm Katie Fehrenbacher. I'm a reporter covering sustainable transportation and electric vehicles. Did a lot with climate tech and clean tech over the past 15 years. And today I'm super excited to talk to my excellent panelists about how to scale an unsung climate champion electric two-wheelers. I think it's a really interesting and fun topic. A lot of the event this week, which has been great, has been, about kind of the business side, how to scale, how to the policy ramifications, things like that. And so I'm really interested to dig into kind of the climate and environmental side of electric two and three wheelers. I'm going to share my screen real quick while I do a little bit of an intro. Here we go. Let's go back. Let's see. And if the screen is very large, you can double click on the large screens to, here we go. And that's us. These are our speakers. I'll introduce them in just a second. But to kick us off, I just wanted to go over a few stats that I think are super interesting from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. A great team over there. They put together the EV Outlook, I think it was late last year. And specifically, they dug into 2 and 3 electric vehicles and the ramifications of growth in that market and kind of where that's going. And so a few stats I wanted to share. Currently, there are over 7 million passenger EVs on the roads today, 500,000 electric buses, 400,000 electric delivery vans and trucks, and 184 million electric mopeds, scooters, motorcycle bikes. So electric 2 and 3 wheelers, 184 million versus 7 million passenger EVs. So I think that's super interesting, super exciting. Some other things, there's over 900 million 2 and 3 wheelers globally. So that's, a lot of them powered by fossil fuels, but they're going electric much faster than others. So some 30% of global 2 and 3 wheeler sales are electric today, and 20% of the existing fleet is electric already. So I thought that was a super interesting stat. A little photo of electric rickshaws from Jeff Bezos and Amazon. So I just think, and maybe one of the most interesting stats is the displacement of oil. So, EVs across all segments are already displacing 1 million barrels of oil demand per day. Most of this is from 2 and 3 wheelers and buses in China. And so this rises to 17.6 million barrels of oil demand per day globally by 2040. So it's really fascinating to me that the electric 2 and 3 wheelers are actually pushing a lot of this oil displacement and a lot of the climate benefits of the electric industry right now. So enough about me. I'm going to stop screen sharing. And so I want to introduce my excellent speakers. We've got Levi Tilleman. He's a former fellow of the New America Foundation and done a ton with sustainable transportation across many aspects. We've got Daniel Sperling. He's automotive board member at the California Air Resources Board. I'm sure a lot of you know about his work with UC Davis. Jasmine Rimmel. She's the global lead of transportation partnerships for Voy Technologies. You might know it, it's a scooter company growing across Europe. And Lucas DeGrassi, he is a driver for Formula E and a sustainability ambassador. And so I'm just going to kick off the conversation so we can learn a little bit more about our speakers. You've all had really deep backgrounds in transportation. What's your connection to the world of electric 2 and 3 wheelers? Lucas, why don't we start with you?
Katie, thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome everyone that has joined the chat. It's a pleasure being here and an honor as well. I'm here on behalf of our latest project, which is in the same way that racing vehicles, that motorsport has shaped in many ways the vehicles that we drive today, and that was the reason that Formula E, people who doesn't know Formula E, is basically an electric Formula One. I helped to create it about 7 years ago. Now we are creating the first world championship of electric micromobility. It's called ESC, so esc.live. If people want to check the website, the idea is to use racing as a driver to push the technology and the safety of micromobility and showcase that the new products and the new features, and also to have fun and to be entertainment around the main cities of the world, with the target of promoting micromobility. And that's our latest project, and it has been going very well. We launched it in the middle of the pandemic, but we are expecting it this year to have the first race. We are ready with some teams, partners, sponsors, cities committed to it. So we're very exciting times ahead.
Thank you, Lucas. Jasmine, why don't you tell us about your connection with 2 and 3 electric wheelers?
Yeah, I think that's also a good transition to Lucas in a sense. So also, first of all, thank you for the intro, Katie, and also pleasure to join this panel tonight. So I'm Yasmin. I'm responsible at Voi for our public transport partnerships and also partnerships in mass platform integrations. And for all of you who are not fully aware who Voi is, so Voi is the leading European micromobility and sharing operator, born and raised in Stockholm, so in the dreamland of bicycle infrastructure, so to say. We have been founded in 2018 with also the vision to bring to sustainable but also safe and inclusive micromobility to European cities. Yeah, we are operating since January 2020, climate neutral. We are currently in more than 15 cities in 11 countries. And big focus has been also the UK during the last couple of months, also as the UK regulation opened up for e-scooters as a safe mode of transport in the course of the pandemic. And currently we hold more than 2/3 of the European licenses. And then we are also pretty much looking forward what 2021 will hold for us, looking then also with one eye to the more transatlantic side.
Thank you, Jasmine. Levi, why don't we turn it over to you?
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me, Katie. This is a really exciting time for micromobility. I think that the pandemic has shown just what a powerful mode of transportation it can be. Let me give you a little bit of my background. So I have spent my career as an entrepreneur. I spent some time as a policymaker working for the Obama administration, and I'm also a writer. I write periodically for Wired, I've written for The New Yorker, and I wrote a book called The Great Race, The Global Quest for the Car of the Future. And as a writer, I love a good story, and nothing gets on my nerves much more than when I see an inaccurate or a bad story. And I think the reason why I got involved with the micromobility space is because there was this narrative that kept cropping up about micromobility being somehow problematic or bad for the environment. And you know, the concept that a 35-pound scooter that utilized energy extraordinarily efficiently and could do almost a complete job in replacing car trips in a radius of, say 1 miles, that was an environmental problem. That was a really bad narrative, and I felt like I wanted to do something to correct that narrative. So I worked together with a graphic designer friend of mine, and we put together a piece for Wired that had a bunch of infographics explaining how micromobility was about 1% the amount of energy on a per mile basis as compared to standard vehicles. It cost about 1% what it costs to get an electric vehicle into the hands of a consumer, to get a micromobility device into the hands of a consumer. And it costs about 2% the cost of fueling a standard internal combustion engine vehicle to fuel a micromobility device. in summary, they're just a really powerful solution to the climate challenges that we have ahead of us. And so I'm really passionate about solving these problems. Today, I'm Vice President for Policy at a company that's currently in stealth called Ample. But I understand that even though that's an electric car company, micromobility has to be a huge part of our solution in terms of dealing with the climate challenge going forward.
Thank you, Levi. Dan, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
And we can see you, but if your video goes out, you can just talk. We can hear you, so that's great. Dan, I think a lot of people in the audience know you already, but we'd kind of love to learn a little bit more about how you're connected with the electric 2- and 3-wheeler world.
Well, my history actually goes back quite a ways. So I did, of course, start out looking at alternative fuels, electric vehicles, and so on. But about 10 or 15 years ago, I started studying the electric 2-wheelers in China. And so I actually did a number of studies in China, and it started with the scooter, the electric bikes and moped type vehicles. And then they started migrating up to these 3-wheelers that are used in rural areas and small towns. And now, of course, I've got a whole center at my institute devoted to micromobility. And so I've been very interested in it, in mobility generally. And I think where I come to this is that I'm very focused on the big picture of transportation. And clearly, we've become too dependent on cars, on light duty vehicles for passenger travel. And so for me, I'm very biased for anything, any competition, any other modes or options. So I've been very enthusiastic about the bikes and the scooters and dockless and skateboards, anything, just to see if we can somehow break up this monoculture. Certainly in the United States, it's more extreme than elsewhere, but it's the same story almost everywhere. And so I think the big challenge is, how do we get these new forms of mobility, how do we get them to be playing a significant role? And, you quote lots of good statistics, but it's really pretty tiny still. The micromobility is still tiny. I've heard some of the other sessions. And so, there's a long ways to go, but really so many trips are short trips. So many car trips could be replaced if we just had better infrastructure, safer policies were appropriate.
I mean, that's a good segue into kind of our first kind of question, particularly given the underappreciated role that these vehicles could play in climate and decarbonization. What do you think are the most important levers that we can pull to scale electric 2- and 3-wheelers? I can go to Dan. I know Levi has strong feelings about that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd start with infrastructure. It's like, it's got to be safe and it's got to be easy to use. I was in Paris for a while, and even Paris, which is doing great things, so many of their streets are cobblestone, and you ride these scooters and bikes on those cobblestones, and it can be a terrifying experience. So that's just I think that's a necessary condition for large scale penetration.
Yeah, Levi, what do you think? Infrastructure number one?
So I completely agree with Dan. I put together a little explainer video for Climate Works about a year and a half ago called Making Space. And it's all about the importance of infrastructure and the fact that if we don't have the bandwidth for these vehicles, they're going to fall short of their transformational potential. But there's a lot more that we can do. Today, every time someone buys an electric car, we give them a subsidy worth $7,500. That adds up to about $2 billion per auto manufacturer, because it's up to 200,000 vehicles and then it phases out over a period of time. That's not a bad thing to do, because we do need to catalyze that transition. But imagine if each micromobility manufacturer had $2 billion of subsidies coming its way. We could do extraordinary things. We could get these vehicles into the hands of a lot more Americans and people around the world. Something else that I would really like to see is some sort of a subsidy for electric passenger miles traveled. And, you know, I think that there are two different kinds of policies that we have to promote clean energy industries. The first really focuses on building infant industries. You have to target specific sectors. You have to give them a boost to kind of get them off and running. But after those industries are launched, we should be looking at where we can get the most bang for our buck from government dollars spent on carbon emissions reduction. And I think passenger miles traveled subsidy for decarbonized miles would put micromobility on an equal playing field with electric cars and with mass transit and with other forms of transportation. So I think that could be a really powerful tool.
Great. So infrastructure, subsidies. Jasmine, as someone who's working on helping an operator scale, what does a company like yours need to grow?
Yeah, I think, like, of course, looking then more also on the policy side, making sure that we have not an overregulated or underregulated market in the cities we are operating. Meaning then also, I mean, how we can foster then the adoption rate, for example. It's then that our like sharing scheme should be really implemented in a social acceptable way. And if we see like non-regulation, for example, also talking on what Daniel was telling or referring to Paris, also looking at Madrid, where we have more than 15 or 20 scooter operator, super cluttered. It's also like from a user experience, you need to have kind of 15 apps on your mobile, and that's not even complemented in one app, so to say. So I think looking then more on a regulation point of view, we need to get profitable in order to build also these powerful public-private partnerships to transform mobility in our cities. But then looking also on a user perspective, which nobody actually serves if we have more than 10 or like even more than 5 scooter operator in a city.
Thank you. I want to keep it on a policy conversation just because there's an interesting question from Rob on the chat channel. You know, what do you think about an SUVs tax, like a tax for horsepower or weight? Is that something you think would be interesting or sustainable, Dan and Levi?
You know, it sounds appealing, but I think the problem is these modes are so different. And, you know, I really like what Levi's saying. And the question really is, so I am a policymaker as well as an academic, and you got to keep it fairly simple in whatever you do. And it's got to be fairly transparent. And so, and the challenge is every city is different. And if you do this on a city level, then it can get a little chaotic. You know, cities don't often have the capacity. There are all kinds of different conditions. There's different politics. So I think, you know, with my academic hat on, I think one of the things we would be good is to lay out some kind of policy framework to implement these kinds of ideas, because I agree totally. I mean, you know, in the beginning when scooters came out, we said they were creating clutter and they were dangerous. Well, heck, just look at cars. You know, cars create a lot more clutter, take up a lot more space, are a lot more dangerous, but we've become conditioned to it. So somehow we've got to shift the discussion and we've got to create some kind of mechanisms. I saw a study where they said in Portland, scooters are paying 10 times as many fees per mile as a car is. And so, you know, that's what's happening out there. It's crazy out there, and it's all new. It's a brand new industry. No one knows how to deal with it, and everyone's always skeptical of the new. So unfortunately, the dockless bikes and scooters get the brunt of a lot of negative
And Lucas,
policy.
I want to kick it over to you. Oh, Levi, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, adding to what Dan said and agreeing completely with everything he says, what we need to do in order to minimize humanity's carbon footprint is to utilize the resources that we have intensively and efficiently. And a very small micromobility device is just a much better utilization of resources in terms of, getting people from point A to point B with a given carbon footprint than a big SUV. But that also holds true for electric vehicles. So when you manufacture an electric vehicle, the carbon footprint of that process is 50 to 100% higher than the carbon footprint would be for manufacturing a normal internal combustion engine vehicle. That's really significant. And what I would like to see is a system that prioritizes lean devices like micromobility that use fewer batteries, that use less aluminum, that use less steel. And then, with respect to electric vehicles, they're still much better than internal combustion engine vehicles from an environmental perspective. But we want to take those embedded emissions and we want to utilize them as efficiently as possible in fleets, in pooled applications. We don't want to build a gajillion electric vehicles and have those people who own them, driving them 1,000 miles a year. We want to build a small number of electric vehicles and have them drive a lot. And then we want people to do the miles that they don't have to do in a vehicle on a device like a scooter or a bicycle, or what I drive is one of those mono wheels that just has one wheel in the center, and I really enjoy it.
All right, I'm going to be looking out for you around the streets of San Francisco now.
Absolutely.
Lucas, I wanted to kick it to you because I think you're the new racing organization that your team has launched is a really interesting way to look at through the lens of communication, storytelling, kind of PR around micromobility. And I think that, that's an interesting angle of kind of a lever that I think the industry needs to push as well.
Yes, Katie, I completely agree with Levi, Daniel, and Jasmine, what has been said about infrastructure. And the reason is because the technology for micromobility is ready. You don't need so much energy density in batteries because the device itself is very efficient. Why big cargo ships or airplanes cannot go electric? Because you don't have the energy density needed in batteries. This technology of the batteries still needs to be developed for such vehicles, including electric cars. We are talking about huge batteries today. These batteries will decrease in size and increase in energy density as the future progresses. But for the energy needs for micromobility devices, we are already there. So what we need is the infrastructure, and what we need is the safety of the people going around. For example, these mono wheels, they can reach up to maybe 30, 40 miles per hour. I've been in one of those, and if you're not an expert of riding it, you can have kind of interesting falls on it. And I experienced myself. I guess Levi has experienced some as well. But the technology is there. So what we need to do, we need to promote safety, which is the core of our championship, to show that people need to ride the scooters or bicycles with helmet. In the racing, of course, because our scooters are very extreme, they're going to reach over 60 miles per hour. They're going to be racing against each other. There will be a little bit of contact. It will be a motorsport sport. So, but safety will be paramount. So we have special barriers, special equipment, a little bit like MotoGP, like a motorcycle rider. But we want to showcase for the younger generation that they must be careful. That safety is an imperative for the adoption of micromobility devices in cities. And agree again, as soon as the infrastructure makes it safer, more people will adopt the usage. It's cheaper. The governments, they should see that. In my opinion, they should put a negative externality tax on other vehicles, which is very straightforward and easy to do, and therefore accelerate this adoption for micromobility. And interesting enough, the micromobility devices, they require so little energy because they're so efficient, like 1% of an electric car, like Levi said. They can use second life batteries. The battery can be even, if the device breaks, it can be transferred to another. In a car, when the battery is already 75% after 10 years, or about 2,000 cycles, it's already thrown away. We can use these batteries for another 10 years in micromobility devices. So actually we could go even carbon negative if we want to take into account the discard of those batteries. So there is a lot still to be developed and pushed and incentivized, and also the education of people of how much better it is. So I think that's the way forward too.
Yeah, I think safety is a super important point when it comes to communications, making people feel comfortable. Earlier on the chat, David Nazaire had an interesting comment about there also has to be a breakthrough in helmets, getting people to use them, best ways to have them on the scooter and on the docks. Jasmine, do you think the industry is doing enough around safety and ensuring that people are wearing helmets and people are safe and comfortable?
Yeah, I think then also the regulation comes into play, right? So if it's like mandatory or not. So speaking from our end, we of course recommend wearing a helmet, but in the end we are like a sharing operator. So what we can do is really like leverage different channels, like offline and online. We, for example, organize also with public authorities kind of safety trainings to promote also the safe adoption for sure. But then I think then it's kind of a paradox again, speaking then of the extension of like bicycle infrastructure, which also plays into that, because we can see, for example, on the report from ITF showcased or demonstrated actually that 80% of accidents with bicycles and e-scooters are caused by cars, meaning then again, so we promote like the safe adoption, we train also on the right behavior, on how actually our e-scooter should be used. But in the end, I think it trickles down again that we need to have a better infrastructure and having also replace car parking by micromobility parking, because that's something we want to also like really push. In the end, it's not only like promote safe use to our users, but also providing a safe environment for non-users, meaning then again, like an inclusive service for elderly people, also for blind people, like all the niche groups, which are sometimes not like always up to mind.
A question, there's an interesting conversation on the chat going on around is micromobility, how much is it replacing cars versus replacing walking? What's the net benefit when you take into walking in consideration as well? And a few people weighed in. But do our panelists have any data or thoughts or information about that, Dan?
Yeah, I do. You know, so I want a full introduction of me would be that I am, in addition to being a board member for the California Air Resources Board, I'm a academic, and I run an Institute of Transportation Studies at University of California, Davis. And we have a center within that institute. We call it Bicycling Plus. That is a micromobility center. And so that group of people, Dylan Fitch and Susan Handy, have been doing a number of studies. And they've also done a review of studies around the world. And I think I was, looking at some of the data, and I think the kind of sense that they're getting, I mean, this is a brand new industry, it's different everywhere, but what they're kind of finding is that that new, like e-bikes and scooters are replacing about a third of the trips total, but these are mostly very short trips. So in terms of amount of vehicle kilometers traveled or vehicle miles traveled, it's probably more in the 3 or 4 or 5% range. And it turns out that they replace, when you say what trips are they replacing? So I said they replace some car trips, and it seems like about a third of the trips replaced are car trips, and roughly half of those are like Uber, Lyft, ride-hailing companies, and half of that are private vehicles. A very small percent is transit, and a significant number is walking. Maybe a third of the trips are walking trips that are replaced. And then there's about 10% more travel. And that's a good thing, actually, because we want people to be more mobile, and they're doing it because they want to access activities and services. So, you know, the data is not really good so far. A lot more analysis needs to be done, and there's going to be more time. But I think those kinds of numbers give a sense of what it is now, and it, you know, and it's in some places where it's safer, there'll tend to be more trips. And, you know, so you go back to infrastructure, right? Infrastructure is the key to this, is that if people are comfortable riding it, feel safe and secure, they will substitute. You know, in my little city of Davis, just bicycles are about a third of all the trips that are taken. And we have good infrastructure for, you know, for bikes and scooters. So I think that really is the lesson. And I think we are going to be replacing, this is not the panacea for cars, you know, to solve the car problem, but it really is a nice piece of it. It solves a nice piece of it. And especially for local communities and neighborhoods, they're a lot more tranquil and safer and accessible when you have scooters and bikes instead of big vehicles.
And Katie, can I jump in with a point on data real quick? I think it's so important for us to have data-driven policies, but we also shouldn't be captive to the data that exists today. We should realize, as Dan said, that the data that we have today is very imperfect. It doesn't represent the ultimate potential of the technologies that we're developing. This conversation happens a lot around electric cars, even around the issue of, you know, the manufacturing footprint of electric cars. You know, just because they're not great today doesn't mean that they can't be great tomorrow. And I think that we should always keep our eye on what is the ultimate potential of this technology going forward.
Are there infrastructure lessons to be learned, how to overcome challenges and build outs from other geographies or other industries? Leva, I'll send it back to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the most obvious the most obvious lessons are that we need to have systems that are modular. We need to have systems that don't require construction for installation when we're talking about docking and things of that nature. And, you know, this has some connection to the company that I'm at right now, but battery swapping is a huge solution. The difference between having to load up 10 scooters in the back of a Ford F-150 and drive them back to a charging depot for repair, and being able to disengage 10 batteries that are, you know, the smaller than a bread box, put them in the back of an electric car, a Honda Civic. You can put 100 electric batteries in the back of a Honda Civic or a Ford F-150 and take them back. You know, that is just huge. And so I think swapping is a huge part of this solution. We're seeing an increased trend not only in micromobility, but some of those photos that you showed of Ola in India with kind of medium mobility, the tuk-tuks in India, and then in China, electric cars, and I think increasingly in the United States, electric cars are also going to turn towards swapping as a big solution.
All right, and we're getting closer to the end of our time. I want to remind anyone in the audience, if you have any burning questions for our speakers, put them in the chat channel. But I have a question I wanted to ask, and I wanted everyone to weigh in if you have thoughts on this. You know, how can micromobility fold itself into the broader climate tech, clean tech conversation and unlock the ESG and subsidies in that way that, you know, this is a massive year going to be for EV infrastructure subsidies, for climate tech subsidies. Kind of how does the micromobility industry kind of get in there and position itself as, you know, a climate solution?
I think a way to think about this is, because it is so local and the infrastructure we're talking about is very local, I think we can set up programs. So we're talking about ideas these days like fee-bates, where if you buy a gas guzzler, you pay a fee. If you buy an electric vehicle, you get a rebate. We could set aside some of that money, or we have cap and trade programs. Europe has it. California has it. We'll probably see it, much broader. We can take some of those funds that are generated and make them available to cities. And it's conditional on the cities need to use it to improve infrastructure, put in, scooter bike lanes, maybe some other infrastructure, but make it conditional. And I think all we need to do, there's lots of money out there. It's a way of getting creative about diverting it and targeting it. And I think targeting it towards cities to use for infrastructure is, to me, is the way to go.
Anyone else have any thoughts on how micromobility can kind of get in on the climate tech subsidy wave that's coming?
I think we should also think about how we can leverage then the technology itself. So, for example, our newest model will have also kind of sensors where they can measure air quality. We know exactly how much emissions per passenger kilometer our new model emit. So we can really then nail it down how much contribution we actually bring to climate change, and can also like measure actually also the air quality. And I think that's also an important step to democratize also kind of micromobility in our cities.
I mean, Katie, part of the solution lies with you. You just have to write about micromobility and tell the world what a great solution it is. Policymakers are people just like anyone else, and they're heavily influenced by what they see in the press. A lot of the time they operate off of imperfect information. This is not a scientific process. The story behind how electric vehicles ended up with a $7,500 tax credit for purchase is that a bunch of staffers got together. They decided $5,000 wasn't enough and $10,000 was too much. And so they cut the baby in half, and they decided $7,500 was, the Solomonic place to arrive at. So this is not a scientific process at all. So we need people to talk about micromobility as a climate solution, and especially journalists.
Yeah, Levi, that's perfect. What I was going to say, I agree with what everybody has said, but the reason I raced in cars here and there, and the reason why we created Formula E was because the technology of electric cars was already there and available, but of the public was not there yet. Sometimes the culture is it's harder to change than the technology or the infrastructure itself. So what we want to do with racing is to make micromobility cool, to make micromobility something which is desired by the younger generation. I have a 3-year-old son. He spends the whole day on his scooter going around the house. He loves the scooter. If we could show to the kids and to the teenagers that we have a cool product, that we have a cool way of moving around, and it's not, for example, in Brazil, it's a status symbol to have a car. If we can break this paradigm that car is a status, and moving more efficiently, cheaper with a very cool device, it's better and nicer, it's better for the environment and better for your pocket and better for everybody. If we can change that, and is what we want to tackle also by making the racing very fun and very cool, I think we can have this adoption faster.
Thanks, Lucas. 2 follow-up questions from our chat channel. Dan, folks are wondering if you had any data on micromobility replacing bicycling.
I include bicycling as micromobility, but in terms of dockless scooters and dockless bikes, there are different kind of trips. I mean, in the end, I think it's great if people own scooters and bikes. I mean, that's a good thing. The dockless part of it makes it convenient for being it more intermodal. And I think that's where you start to see the benefits is, people can use it for a one-way trip, or they can use it to access a train or bus, and they can use it, in different ways. So the data, there's a little bit of data, but I'm not even going to repeat it because, it's not good enough these days to really make any assertions, except that it's clearly, I mean, what we're all saying here, it's a low carbon, it's healthy, and it's good for our cities, it's good for sustainability. And so I think our strategy needs to be to figure out how best to bring it about. And there's lots and lots of market niches. What we've learned, I mean, scooters, it was just out of the blue. It came and they were so popular. It was because we don't even understand. I have a whole team of people studying travel behavior. None of them had done a study that said, if you had a scooter, this is what the market share would be. So we need a lot of and a lot of documentation.
And I just want to amplify the point that Dan is making there, which is America drives about 3.3 trillion miles every single year. We have to transition all of those miles to clean mobility. With all of the electric cars that have been sold since 2008, we have only cumulatively driven about 50 billion miles. So the market is, for all intents and purposes, infinite. We have so much to do. We have so much to accomplish. This isn't about micromobility displacing bicycle rides or walking or bus rides or anything like that. We need more micromobility. We need more bus rides. We need more people cycling. We need more of all of that. And when we get into this mindset of, is micromobility taking market share away from one of these other solutions, we've already lost the conversation. All of them have to grow dramatically at a scale that is unprecedented in the history of economic development of the world. And that is the challenge of the next decade or two. It has to be a decade of delivery on clean energy technologies.
Thanks, Levi. Interesting comment on the chat channel. I think this is for Lucas, but maybe just a comment. Someone needs to make a Top Gear for micromobility. Lucas, any takers?
Yeah, I love that comment. Yes, we have to make micromobility cool. That was the point of doing that. But also another point, we need to make the devices of micromobility, because now at the moment we're kind of restricted into more of the younger generation can ride a monowheel, a scooter, an electric bike. And as the population age, we need to provide good other solutions of micromobility. I think micromobility, when we're talking here, can grow to a very wide span of purpose-driven technology that is different in Sweden than in Brazil, than in India, like the rickshaws and so on. So we can have a wide variety of use cases, and different technologies will emerge also.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you, Lucas. All right, we're going to have to wrap up. I just want to thank all of our speakers, Levi, Dan, Jasmine, Lucas.